Brendon.
Hello, Steven.
We've been asked a version of this many times, but recently we were asked by a listener, a patron actually, to recommend like games to get into certain genres or series for a newcomer. I think one of my favorite journeys you have gone on in the time we've done the show, this podcast Into the Aether, is going from someone who like wanted to but could never really get into turn-based RPGs, and now you are co-hosting a section about which Dragon Quest game to start with. But we thought for today's Out of the Aether, we would talk about which Dragon Quest game serves as the best introduction to the series. And I think, honestly, with Dragon Quest itself as a series, I think works as an introduction to the genre as a whole.
Yeah.
So I think in many ways, this is like the ultimate piece of vocabulary to have when entering the genre.
No, totally. I recently was at a party where I felt like I was holding court in somebody's kitchen talking about exactly this. So this like couldn't have been better timed. I feel like all of these thoughts are very fresh. But you and I have played, honestly, most of the Dragon Quest games at this point, or at least like not through all the way, but like large chunks and swaths of the series. I think between the two of us, there's maybe only one or two that we haven't like really seen most of. I think it's worth mentioning that for both you and I, you are coming at this from a perspective of somebody who has loved turn-based RPGs for a long time. You specifically really loved Final Fantasy growing up. You, like many people, were super into Final Fantasy VII, formative game for you, et cetera, et cetera. Did not dip into Dragon Quest for years and years and years until also we were doing the show. You and I both got into the franchise with Dragon Quest XI when that launched on Switch. You got it on the PS4 when it had the like synthetic score and not the symphonic score.
Yeah, the strange like Fisher-Price keyboard. Yeah.
And that specifically was the thing that turned you around on it, was when you went back and played the Switch version and it had the symphonic score, but also
on Xbox, actually, the same version, the definitive edition. Yeah, I mean, I think music plays a big part in all RPGs, but I think for Dragon Quest XI especially, it really dictates the emotion of the scenes, because like I love this series, but it's not really known for like dialogue. The music is really serving as like the director of a lot of these story beats. So having that full orchestral soundtrack, I actually think is crucial to enjoying that game.
Yeah.
All that to say, like I think Dragon Quest XI is the easy one to start with. It's the most recent entry. It is the easiest to get into. I think it sets you up for success the best. It requires the least grinding, at least early on. It's in many ways a celebration of the series. So it has bits and pieces of every other game. So it works for longtime fans who are like, oh my God, that's a reference to this and this and this. But if you end up going backwards, if you start with 11 and then end up playing 5 or whatever, which you should play 5, maybe not first, but that's a really good one. You end up seeing, like, you learn that retroactively, and that's fun to discover as well.
Yeah.
So 11, I think, is just, I mean, it's also available everywhere. You can play it on, it's great on Switch. It's great on, pretty much every modern console. I think that is like the easy one. I do have other ones in mind if you like have a preference for certain styles of RPGs, because even though Dragon Quest has kind of made its reputation is rooted in not routine, but like familiarity. Like it's never going to stray too far from what you want and expect from a Dragon Quest. But I think each game does have a very distinct focus. And 11, I think, is kind of just playing the hits in a way that makes it the easiest entry point.
Yeah, 11 definitely. I think 11 is the game where, for you, the person listening to / watching this, like, I don't know you at all right now. And I think that 11 is the one you should probably start with. Like, I don't need to know anything about a person to say that Dragon Quest 11 is probably the one that they should start with. I do think once you get into nuances about what people like in specific kinds of games is when you can maybe deviate into some of the other ones. But like, as blanket a statement as you could possibly make about the franchise, 11 is like the obvious home run. They nailed it. This is a great entry point for everybody. And I think you're totally right in pointing out that, like, as a celebration of the series, it is great for longtime fans, but it is also giving you bits and fragments of what rocks about all the other ones. So by the time you're done with Dragon Quest XI, you will be so ready for every other game that you can just literally follow your whims. You can go on any forum thread from the past 30 years and see what people have argued is the best Dragon Quest game and just go to that one next and probably have a pretty good time based on having played 11 first. Yeah. I do think my one thing about 11 that is worth mentioning, and you and I have talked about this a lot, is like, if you're going to go into that game, as with all long ass RPGs, give it a whole bunch of time before you like.
It has a slow
bail from
start.
Yeah.
It really has a slow start in both a narrative way. Like I think it gets much more interesting, but I think early on it really feels like, oh, this is like really kind of tried and true stuff.
Oh, I'm the chosen one and I have to find crystals?
Yes,
Cool.
exactly.
Yeah.
It does really, it has a cool spin on that later, not to spoil, but the story does pick up. But I think narratively it feels maybe like overly familiar. And then also combat wise, you really can just do like attack an item for the first like couple hours.
Yeah.
And I also think if you are someone, if you're listening to this and you're like, cool, that sounds interesting, but I grew up with Final Fantasy, I need a little bit more angst and grit to my RPGs. Start with 8. 8 is basically Dragon Quest XI in all ways, but with a stranger and less immediately likable cast.
Right.
If you like flawed characters that have, you know, cathartic arcs, I think like 11, the characters are great, but I think they all are like much like the crew of Next Generation, just like immediately likable and charming and kind of stay that way for the whole game. 8, I think, has a lot of like really flawed, interesting characters that have to get over something. And of course, our Lord and Savior, Yangus, who is really the star of the show. Somehow.
Yangus is maybe like top 5 video game characters.
Yes. Yangus is your best introduction to games as a whole. Even though Dragon Quest VIII is the second best intro to the series.
I think another crime that Enix has committed against us is that we never got the Yangus spin-off game that released in Japan. I want to play that so badly. You play as a young Yangus, which just sounds like Yangus already as an adult feels very much like a person who's following his whims in the way a child would. To experience what he would be like as a child, I think would be incredible. But yes, I totally agree with you. I think the sense of ensemble in 11 is so strong and so cool. And there are arcs to those characters, definitely. But you're totally right that like where they start is largely where they end. It's just they go through some hardship in the middle there. And 8 is very much about like every person in your crew is a little messed up.
Yeah.
And they're all striving to be better. And by the end of that game, they will be better because that's how all these games work. I think the thing about Dragon Quest that's worth just shouting out is like they're bedtime stories, really. They are like, by and large, as by the books of fable as possible. And that is one of the things that makes them so comforting and so relaxing and makes each of them an equally valid starting point. But I do think that 8 after 11 is like probably the most obvious place to start.
Yeah, and I also think that in terms of the combat, like 8 almost has the opposite problem of 11, where they throw you in the deep end right away. Like that first cave, you have to really grind for that first boss. But at the same time, I think you get a stronger sense of the mechanics and like what the possibilities are, where like in both 8 and 11, every character has like a skill tree you can invest in. And kind of, they all have a clear role to play, but you can kind of mold them to be something more specific, which I think is a nice middle ground between like some of the materia system where they're just totally blank slates other than what spells you give them.
Yeah.
And then games like Final Fantasy X where you have like set classes for every character, unless you max out the sphere grid, but that's another episode. I'm curious what your third pick would be, because honestly, when you mentioned the Angus spin-off game, I didn't really have a third one in mind. Like I think I have games like once you've played 11 or 8, I have other Dragon Quests to recommend depending on what you liked about them. Like I think 5 is one of our personal favorites and is this really emotional story about becoming a parent and weirdly also kind of Pokemon-esque.
5 is one of the best games of all time.
Yes,
just to say it very plainly,
yes,
it is
you should
an
play
incredible
5.
video game. Yeah.
The DS remake is fantastic and is also what the mobile port is basically pulling from.
There's also a great fan translation of the PS2 version of 5, which I would recommend as well.
But to get into the series, this might be a hot take, but I think my third recommendation would be Dragon Quest Builders 2.
I love that.
Which is not a like official Dragon Quest game or not like a mainline Dragon Quest game, but I think it does communicate the charm and the atmosphere and is sort of like a Minecraft type game, but I think is less about like the full sandbox of Minecraft and more like how do you make kind of a little engine that keeps going with or without you? You know, how do you make a town that works for the people there? So I think if you need to know like what is the thing that I'm gonna go back to Dragon Quest for, what is that warm feeling, that, you know, thing I can't put words to, I think that is very present and is almost like the driving factor of Dragon Quest Builders too.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great pick. Those games are both really wonderful. I think 2 is like definitely a step up from the first one and is also widely available on most platforms. I do know that 1 is now out on mobile, which I think is, for people who want to play on mobile, I think that's probably a good place to start as well, but definitely go for 2 if you can. I think mine is a little bit of a swerve in that I would say probably Dragon Quest IV would be the next one I would recommend. So if you're a person who is like interested specifically in kind of Super Nintendo era RPGs, if you like that feeling, if you like that vibe, if you like that art, the remake of 4 I think is a great place to start, because 4, 5, and 6 are kind of this little trilogy that's worth playing out entirely. 4 is told through a series of vignettes where you play as a bunch of different characters, starting with like this warrior and then a mage, and eventually another amazing Dragon Quest character who is this merchant who has a great little story all his own. You play through all of these stories before they all converge and become like one party that is traveling throughout the world, but it's like hours and hours and hours of just kind of like settling into the lives of these people before you get that catharsis of now the team is all together. And that is a great way to tell a story, and like a huge leap in terms of where Dragon Quest was at with the 3rd game and where it's at with the 4th game. That original trilogy has its own, like great stuff going on. But I think in general, I would say start with 4 if you are interested in that kind of game, and work your way through the franchise from there, and then go back and experience 1, 2, and 3 if you really want to be a completionist about it. But I think this collection that we've just put together here, like 11, obvious starting point. 8, if you're like, I want a little bit more grit. Builders or 4, depending on like how into the actual RPG-ness of it all you are, is like a great little rubric to follow for getting into Dragon Quest.
I agree. And then eventually play 5. It's really all in service of eventually playing 5.
Yes. And then if you really want to be a sicko like me, you can eventually be like, 6 and 7 aren't as bad as people say.
Yeah. Eventually you're playing 10 somehow.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you're holding your phone up with the Google Lens Translate and like real time translating everything that's happening in the game, which I'll be honest, I tried. It didn't work very well. It was not a fun way to play the video game. I do know there's a version. We don't have to get into it. There's a way to do it on Windows. Anyway, that's probably going to do it for us on this edition of Out of the Aether.
I will say, if you are also a big Dragon Quest fan and you feel strongly that another one works as an intro, please let us know. Put it in the comments. I would love to see the logic behind these choices, because we definitely have some hot takes here, or at least some of them.
As someone who just played through Dragon Quest I all the way through, I'm going to be surprised if anybody says Dragon Quest I.
Start with 1. It's funny how rarely the first game is actually the best one to start with. But
well, that's the thing, right? Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior, depending on where you lived, is like the first one of these, really.
Right.
And believe it or not, they didn't get everything right.
On that note, always try again. We'll see you next time. Into the Casted Online.
Yes. Catch you later. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.